Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I used to work as a night custodian for a small town historical museum. You wouldn't believe the weird things you find cleaning old places, shadows in corners that feel too dark, creaks in the floors where no one's walking. But this happened one night, and it still chills me to the bone. The museum was housed in what used to be the town's old courthouse, built in the late 1800 seconds. It was a grand, imposing building with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and that faint, musty smell of age. My job was to clean the exhibit halls and offices after hours, alone. That night started like any other. I plugged in my headphones, grabbed my mop bucket, and set to work on the upstairs gallery. The exhibits up there were a mishmash of old photographs, artifacts from the pioneer days, and, my least favorite, an old judge's bench and witness stand, complete with a life-size mannequin and period clothing. I had just finished mopping the gallery floor and was gathering my supplies when I noticed something strange. The mannequin's head was turned. It wasn't much, just a slight tilt, but I was sure it hadn't been like that earlier. I chalked it up to my imagination and moved on. An hour later, I was downstairs vacuuming the main lobby when I heard a loud thud upstairs. My heart jumped. The museum was locked, and I was the only one with a key. I turned off the vacuum and listened. Silence, probably just something falling over, I muttered, trying to convince myself. I went upstairs to check it out, my flashlight cutting through the dim light. The mannequin was no longer behind the judge's bench. It was standing in the middle of the room. My stomach dropped. I told myself someone must have been playing a prank, maybe a coworker, but as I approached it, I noticed something even worse. Its hands. They were different. The mannequin was supposed to be holding a gavel in one hand, but now both hands were clenched into fists, and they looked real. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my mop bucket, and sprinted for the stairs. As I reached the top step, I felt a cold gust of air brush past me like someone running by. I turned and pointed my flashlight back into the gallery. The mannequin wasn't there anymore. I bolted downstairs, grabbed my bag, and ran out the front door. I didn't even lock up. The museum director called me the next morning, furious about the unlocked doors and my abandoned cleaning supplies. I didn't care. I quit on the spot. A week later, a friend who still worked there sent me a text. Apparently, some school kids on a tour had pointed out faint, reddish stains on the mannequin's hands. They looked like dry blood. After I quit, I tried to put the museum out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't tell many people about what happened. Those I did tell brushed it off as stress, a prank, or even a dream. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I knew better. A few months passed, and I started to sleep better. Then, out of nowhere, I got another text from my friend who still worked at the museum. It was a photo of a crumpled piece of paper. At first, I couldn't make it out, but as I zoomed in, I realized it was a torn page from an old guest ledger. Scribbled in spidery handwriting across the faded lines was one sentence: "Get him back." I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. I called my friend immediately, but they didn't pick up. It wasn't like them not to answer, especially after sending something so cryptic. I tried again, still nothing. 2 days later, I got another text, this one just as eerie. It was a blurry photo of the mannequin, but this time, it wasn't in the museum. It looked like it was standing in a shadowy hallway. My blood ran cold. I recognized that hallway. It was in my apartment building. I didn't even think. I grabbed a knife from my kitchen and started checking every room in my place, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. I checked the locks on my windows and doors. They were secure. Still, I barely slept that night. The next day, I decided to visit the museum. I didn't want to, but I needed answers. When I got there, I found the place closed. The director, pale and visibly shaken, was talking to police outside. I approached cautiously, and before I could say anything, the director blurted, "It's gone." "What's gone?" I asked, dreading the answer. "The mannequin," she said, her voice trembling. "It's just gone." I didn't tell her about the photo I received. I didn't tell anyone. I just left. I knew I wasn't safe, and I knew it wasn't over. That night, I woke up to a loud knocking at my door. It wasn't the kind of knock that comes from someone politely asking to come in. It was frantic, pounding, almost violent. I froze in bed, gripping the knife I'd started keeping under my pillow. The knocking stopped, and then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through my living room. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard the door open. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. I stayed as still as possible, my breath shallow and silent. The footsteps moved closer and closer until they stopped just outside my bedroom door. I gripped the knife tighter, ready to fight, but then I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice, a faint creaking, like the bending of wood. Slowly, I turned my head to the door and I saw it. A shadow, tall, distorted, and unmistakably inhuman, stretched under the crack of my door. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, my neighbors were banging on my door, asking if I was okay. The shadow was gone. The police were called, but they didn't find anything. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. I moved out the next day. Moving out gave me some peace, but it didn't last. Even in a new apartment, miles from the museum, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. At first, it was subtle, things being slightly out of place, a strange creak in the floorboards when I was sure I hadn't moved. Then, the dream started, and every dream, I was back in the museum. The mannequin was there, but it wasn't behind the judge's bench. It was closer. Sometimes it was in the gallery, sometimes in the stairwell, always staring at me with those lifeless eyes and clenched fists. In the dreams, I couldn't move. I could only watch as it crept closer, inch by inch, until its wooden hand reached out to touch me. I always woke up before it did, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. One night, though, I didn't wake up in time, and in the dream, its hand gripped my arm, hard and ice cold. When I finally jolted awake, my arm was burning with pain. I turned on the light and saw it, a faint bruise shaped like long, spindly fingers. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. I knew it wasn't just a dream. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe I had developed some sort of sleep disorder, or maybe the stress from the museum had finally broken me. I even saw a therapist, but they couldn't explain the bruises or the eerie feelings that followed me everywhere. Then one night, something happened that left no room for doubt. I had just gotten home from work and was settling into bed when I heard a noise from my closet. It was faint, like a soft rustling, but unmistakable. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining things. Then, the closet door creaked open, just an inch. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stared at the sliver of darkness that now loomed in the room. Slowly, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, and I saw it. Standing in the back of my closet was the mannequin. Its head was tilted at that same unnatural angle, but its face wasn't blank anymore. Its features were faint, like they had been crudely carved into the wood. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were deep, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. Before I could scream, the closet door slammed shut, shaking the walls. I bolted out of my apartment and didn't look back. I drove to a friend's house and stayed there for the night, refusing to go back alone. The next day, I called the museum director. I didn't care if she thought I was crazy. I needed to know if anyone else had experienced anything like this. When she answered, her voice was shaky. "You're not the first," she said after a long pause. "The mannequin, it's been part of the museum since before I started working here. We don't know where it came from, but every time someone moves it, something happens." "What do you mean, something happens?" I demanded. She hesitated, then said, "The last custodian, he quit too. Same kind of things you're describing." And before him, the guy who helped with the exhibit had a breakdown. Said he couldn't sleep because he kept saying it in his house. I hung up without saying another word. I didn't need to hear any more. I packed my things and moved again, this time across the country. For a while, things were better. I started to feel normal again, but every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a tall, shadowy figure just beyond the edge of the light. And every time, I feel that same cold gust of air, like a whisper against my skin. To this day, I keep every closet door locked. I never leave my curtains open at night, and I never, ever let myself think about what would happen if it found me again. This happened about 6 years ago when I was in college. I used to pick up odd jobs to make extra money, and one of the gigs I found was through a temp agency. They sent me to this enormous warehouse on the outskirts of town to help with inventory for a few nights. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well for a college kid, so I didn't think twice about accepting. The warehouse was strange. It was part of a much larger facility that appeared mostly abandoned, except for a small section that was still in use. When I arrived on my first night, the place was eerily quiet, lit only by buzzing fluorescent lights that seemed to flicker just enough to unnerve me. The manager, a gruff man named Steve, barely said 2 words to me other than to point me to the section I'd be working in. "Don't wander," he added sternly, as if he was issuing a warning. I laughed it off, assuming he was just trying to keep me from slacking. My task was simple: count in log boxes in a specific aisle. I was working alone, and the warehouse was massive. The further you walked, the darker it got, like the lights were either broken or not turned on for those sections anymore. I figured I'd just stay in my lane, literally and finished my shift. Around midnight, I heard a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the hum of the ventilation system, but then it got louder. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but they were uneven, like someone limping or dragging something heavy. I stopped what I was doing and listened, but the sound faded quickly. I told myself it was just Steve moving around and went back to work. But then I heard it again, closer this time, and this time, it was accompanied by a faint metallic scraping. It sounded like someone was dragging a piece of metal across the floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. No response. I tried to shake it off and keep working, but my nerves were shot. The scraping continued intermittently, sometimes seeming far away, sometimes uncomfortably close. At one point, I was so on edge that I decided to check it out. Big mistake. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the sound. It led me deeper into the warehouse, past the aisles I was assigned to, and into a part of the building that wasn't lit at all. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of rusted machinery, stacks of pallets, and empty shelving. The sound was louder now, and as I rounded a corner, I froze. In the beam of my flashlight was a figure. He was hunched over, wearing what looked like a filthy jumpsuit. Its back was to me, and it appeared to be dragging a long, metal pipe across the floor. The figure stopped moving the moment my light hit it, like it sensed me. I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as the figure slowly turned its head toward me. I'll never forget its face, or rather, the lack of one. The face was obscured by some kind of mask or sack, with crudely cut eye holes that didn't seem to align properly. It tilted its head, as if curious, then took a step toward me. I ran. I dropped my flashlight and bolted back toward the lit part of the warehouse, the sound of the draggy metal pipe growing louder behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the manager's office, slamming the door behind me and locking it. Steve looked up from his desk, startled. "What the hell's wrong with you?" I tried to explain, but I was barely coherent. He just sighed and grabbed a flashlight of his own. "Stay here," he said, and headed out. I waited, shaking, for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes. Steve came back, his expression unreadable. "There's no one out there," he said flatly. "You're imagining things." I quit that job on the spot. As I left, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The bottom of Steve's boots were caked in dust and grime, the kind you'd only get from walking in the unused parts of the warehouse. After quitting on the spot, I expected Steve to argue with me, maybe even try to stop me from leaving. But he didn't. He just watched as I walked out the door, his expression blank and unreadable. The whole encounter left me with a heavy sense of unease. When I got to my car, I realized I was still shaking. My hands trembled as I started the engine and drove away, constantly glancing in my rearview mirror. The warehouse quickly disappeared in the distance, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me the whole way home. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the filthy jumpsuit, the crooked eye holes in its mask, the sound of the metal pipe scraping the floor. I tried to tell myself it was some kind of prank, or maybe even my imagination playing tricks on me in that creepy old building. But something about Steve's reaction didn't sit right with me. Why was he so calm about it? Why didn't he seem surprised? The next morning, I decided to do some digging. The warehouse wasn't far from campus, and a quick internet search turned up a handful of articles about the facility. Most of them were old, dated from the early 2000s, but one caught my attention, a piece about the closure of the warehouse after a workplace accident. According to the article, a worker had been crushed by a faulty piece of equipment in one of the unused sections of the building. His name wasn't mentioned, but the article stated that the incident had led to a lawsuit, which the company quietly settled. The family of the victim accused the company of negligence, claiming they'd ignored safety protocols and left dangerous machinery in disrepair. The story gave me chills. Could the figure I saw have been some kind of ghost? Or maybe a deranged squatter who'd taken up residence in the abandoned parts of the warehouse? I wasn't sure which explanation scared me more. I tried to put it behind me, but the unease lingered. A week later, I got a call from the temp agency. They asked if I'd be willing to return to the warehouse for another shift. I immediately said no, but I couldn't resist asking if they'd heard anything unusual about the place. The woman on the other end of the line paused before answering. "We've had a few complaints," she admitted. "Some workers reported hearing strange noises, seeing things, but it's an old building, you know, probably just rats or structural noises." Her tone was dismissive, but I could tell she didn't entirely believe what she was saying. I thanked her and hung up, but her words stuck with me. If multiple people had experienced something strange, it wasn't just my imagination. The final straw came a few months later. I was walking home from class late one evening when I heard it again, the sound of metal scraping against concrete. At first, I thought it was construction work or a dumpster being moved, but then I froze. The rhythm was exactly the same as what I'd heard in the warehouse. I turned around, my heart pounding, and scanned the empty street behind me. There was nothing there. No movement, no sign of anyone, but the sound persisted, faint and distant, as if it was following following me. I didn't run this time. I forced myself to walk calmly the rest of the way home, locking every door and window behind me. I haven't heard the sound since, but I still think about that night. Life moved on, and I did my best to forget about the warehouse and the unnerving experiences that came with it. I graduated, found a decent job, and settled into a routine. For a while, I thought I'd successfully put it behind me, but every now and then I'd hear something, a scraping sound at a parking garage, the metallic clang of a loose piece of machinery, and my chest would tighten, my stomach knotting with that old fear. About a year ago, I moved to a new city for work. It was far enough away that I thought I'd left everything about that part of my life behind, but then something happened that brought it all rushing back. It started innocently enough. I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment, trying to make the place feel like home. My unit is on the top floor of a 4-story building with a view overlooking the street below. I've always liked living high up, less chance of anyone sneaking around, right? One night, a few weeks after I moved in, I was up late working on a project for work. It was past midnight, and the city had gone quiet outside. I was sitting at my desk when I heard it, the faint, rhythmic scraping of metal on concrete. I froze. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, or maybe someone moving furniture in another unit. But deep down, I knew better. The sound was too familiar, too specific. I got up and went to the window, peering out onto the street below. It was empty, except for a single streetlight casting a weak glow on the pavement. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing moved. After a few minutes, I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to my desk. The next night, it happened again. This time, the sound was louder, and it seemed to be coming from inside the building. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the hallway. The building was quiet, too quiet. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear, but the sound had stopped. I walked down the hall, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing. When I got back to my apartment, I locked the door and went straight to bed, hoping sleep would erase the unease gnawing at me. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept imagining that figure from the warehouse, the mask, the draggy pipe. Over the next few weeks, the sound came and went at random. Sometimes it was faint and distant, like it was coming from another floor. Other times, it was so close that I could swear it was right outside my door. I started losing sleep, jumping at every little noise. I even considered moving again, but the lease had just started, and I couldn't afford to break it. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of scraping directly outside my bedroom window. I live on the 4th floor. My blood ran cold. I didn't dare move, didn't even breathe. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The blinds were closed, but I could see the faint outline of something pressed against the glass. It was a hand. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the receiver as I tried not to make a sound. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but those few minutes felt like an eternity. I stayed frozen, staring at the window until I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. When the police arrived, they found no sign of anyone. No handprints on the glass, no evidence of someone climbing up the side of the building. But the officers didn't leave me empty-handed. As they were leaving, one of them mentioned that I wasn't the first person in the area to report something strange. A few weeks earlier, a man in a neighboring building had complained about hearing scraping sounds outside his door late at night. When he finally opened the door, he found nothing but a long, rusted pipe lying across the threshold. I don't know if I'll ever escape this thing, or if it's even a thing that can be escaped. All I know is that it followed me once, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. It was Halloween night, and I was home alone handing out candy. My neighborhood is the kind of place where kids swarm the streets in costumes, their laughter filling the air. Parents linger at the end of driveways, chatting and sipping coffee from travel mugs. It's usually safe and lively, the perfect small-town suburbia. Around 9:30 p.m., the crowd thinned out. The younger kids had gone home, and only the occasional group of teenagers came by. I was starting to pack up my decorations when I noticed a figure standing at the end of my driveway, just outside the halo of the streetlight. It wasn't unusual for older kids to trick or treat late, but this person was just standing there, not moving, not calling out for candy. They wore a tattered, old-fashioned costume, a dusty brown coat, wide-brimmed hat, and a mask that looked handmade, like a papier-mâché face frozen in a sad expression. "Hey there," I called out, trying to keep my voice light. "Want some candy before I close up?" No response. They tilted their head, almost like they were studying me. The chill ran down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, probably just some teenager messing around, but the way they they stood, completely still except for the slight tilt of their head, was unnerving. Okay, well, happy Halloween, I said, a little more forcefully this time, hoping they'd move on. But they didn't. Instead, they took a step closer, their footfall heavy enough to echo in the quiet night. I backed up to my door, keeping my eyes on them. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. They didn't move like a teenager pulling a prank. Their steps were deliberate, slow, almost menacing. I slipped inside and locked the door, peeking out through the window. They were still there, now standing in the middle of my driveway, staring at the house. I turned off the porch light, hoping they'd get bored and leave. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I froze. This sound wasn't coming from the front door but from the side of the house. My blood turned to ice. How could they have gotten there so fast? I crept to the side window, heart pounding. The figure was there, standing in the shadows. They raised their hand and tapped on the glass with something metal, a long, thin object, maybe a blade. The papier-mâché mask grinned at me now, the sad expression replaced with a grotesque, toothy smile that hadn't been there before. I backed away, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. As I explained what was happening, the operator asked me to stay on the line. I couldn't hear her over the sudden pounding on my front door. I screamed, "They're trying to get in." I ran to the back of the house, locking myself in the bathroom. I could hear heavy footsteps now, circling the house, thudding against windows and doors. Then, silence. I stayed in the bathroom until the police arrived, trembling and clutching a pair of scissors. When they searched the property, they found nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. It was like the stranger had vanished into thin air. The only clue they left behind was the mask, propped neatly on my porch. A single line was scrawled inside in shaky, black letters, "Situ next to her." I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every creak in the house, every rustle of wind against the windows felt like a prelude to the stranger's return. I sat on the couch, clutching my phone and staring at the mask the police left behind as evidence. They assured me it was probably a Halloween prank gone too far, maybe a drunk teenager. But something about the precision, the unnatural way they moved and disappeared, didn't feel human. The next morning, I installed new locks and a security system, cameras, motion detectors, the works. My house turned into a fortress. Over the next few days, I obsessed over the footage, hoping for some clue. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone approaching the house or leaving the mask. A week passed, then two. I started to convince myself it really had been a Halloween prank. A weird, creepy one, but harmless in the end. I went back to my routine, though I never quite felt at ease. I avoided looking out windows at night, and my porch light stayed off long after Halloween decorations had come down around the neighborhood. And then, just as I was starting to forget, the knocking came again. It was late, well past midnight, and it wasn't coming from the front door this time. It was at my bedroom window. A steady, deliberate tap. I froze, too terrified to move. My bedroom is on the second floor. Gathering every ounce of courage, I inched toward the window and peeked through the blinds. My stomach dropped. The mask was there, pressed against the glass, staring straight at me. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind the mask was a face, or at least what looked like one. Pale, almost translucent skin stretched over angular bones. Its eyes were wide, bulging, and impossibly dark. A thin, unnaturally long hand reached up and tapped the glass again, its fingers curling as if beckoning me closer. I stumbled backward, my phone slipping from my hand. I heard it laugh, a low, raspy sound that didn't belong to anything human. My instinct screamed at me to run, but where? It was outside my window, and I was trapped. The tapping stopped abruptly. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. As I spoke, I heard footsteps inside the house. The operator stayed on the line as I locked myself in the bathroom again, trying not to hyperventilate. The footsteps were heavy, purposeful, and they were getting closer. I thought I was going to die. Then, just as quickly as they started, they stopped. When the police arrived, they found nothing again, no sign of a break-in, no intruder, no mask at the window. I begged them to check the security footage, desperate for proof I wasn't losing my mind. They reviewed it, and that's when I saw their faces turn pale. The cameras had captured the mask, but not just at the window. It was everywhere. One moment, it was on the porch, the next, in my backyard, then, somehow, at the top of my staircase. The final clip showed it staring directly into the camera, tilting its head in that same slow, deliberate way, and then the footage cut out. The police told me to stay somewhere else for the night. I packed a bag and went to my sister's house, but I didn't tell her everything. How could I? I didn't even understand what was happening myself. That was 2 months ago. I've since sold the house and moved to a new city, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every Halloween, I dread the nightfall. I keep my lights off, my windows covered, and my phone within arm's reach. Movie didn't ease my mind as much as I hoped it would. At first, the new city felt like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life without the shadow of that night looming over me. But paranoia isn't something you can leave behind like furniture. It follows you, creeping in during the quiet moments. I started avoiding Halloween altogether. No decorations, no candy, no acknowledgement of the day. If anyone asked why, I'd brush it off fault for the vague excuse about not being into the holiday. People seem to accept it, though I catch some neighbors giving me funny looks when they saw my darkened porch surrounded by brightly lit houses. The first Halloween in my new place passed uneventfully, and for a while, I started to relax. The tappy didn't come back, and the cameras I had installed around my new house never caught anything unusual. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I'd escaped. But then the letter arrived. It was mid-October the following year, just as the stores started putting up their Halloween displays. I found it in my mailbox, tucked between some junk mail and a utility bill. It was a plain, white envelope with no return address. My name was written on the front in a shaky, uneven hand. I stood there on my porch, staring at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle, like it had been aged artificially. The message was short, written in the same jagged handwriting. "You moved. I found you." My blood ran cold. I immediately checked the security footage from the cameras, scanning the recordings for any sign of someone near my house. Nothing. Whoever left the letter was careful to stay out of sight. I wanted to call the police, but what could I tell them? That someone sent me a creepy letter. They wouldn't take it seriously, not without proof of a real threat. So I threw the letter away and tried to convince myself it was a prank. But the feeling of being watched returned. Every time I left the house, I felt eyes on me. Every shadow felt deeper, every sound more menacing. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my doorbell ringing. It was 3 a.m. My heart was pounding as I checked the camera feed on my phone. The screen showed nothing, just the empty porch bathed in the faint glow of the porch light. The doorbell rang again. This time, I caught movement at the edge of the frame. Something darted out of view, too fast for me to see clearly. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching my phone as the ringing turned into a slow, deliberate knocking. Knock, knock, knock. It was rhythmic, almost mocking. I couldn't bring myself to look again. I stayed in bed, trembling, until the sound stopped. In the morning, I found another letter on my porch. This one wasn't in an envelope. The paper was damp, as if it had been left out in the dew for hours. The message was just one word: soon. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept every light in the house on and sat by the front window with a kitchen knife, staring into the dark. My phone buzzed with a notification from the security app just after midnight. Motion detected, and my hand shook as I opened the app. The camera feed showed my backyard, where the figure stood again. The same costume, the same grotesque mask. They tilted their head, looking directly into the camera, and raised a hand. This time, they waved. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. The police don't believe me. They keep telling me it's a prank, some neighbor trying to scare me. But it's not. This thing, whatever it is, it's not human. It knows where I live. It knows I'm alone, and it's not going to stop. I'm leaving again tomorrow, packing up what I can and driving as far as possible. I don't know if it'll help, but I have to try. To the Halloween stranger, if you're reading this, please, let's not meet ever again. I volunteer at a small, understaffed animal shelter in a quiet town. Most of my shifts are during the day, but once a month, I cover the overnight shift for emergencies. It's not a big deal, just a few animals needing overnight care and the occasional oddball who shows up late to drop off a stray or ask about adoption. A few weeks ago, I had one of those overnight shifts. The shelter itself is small, just a front office, a few kennels, and a tiny break room with a cot for naps. Most of the night was uneventful. I fed the animals, walked the dogs in the enclosed yard, and even dozed off for a bit. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was one of the dogs, but it wasn't coming from the kennel area. It sounded like it was coming from the front office. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight, my heart pounding as I crept toward the noise. The front office is connected to a glass door that looks out onto the parking lot. As I approached, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A man was crouched by the door, scratching at the glass with his nails. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and he was muttering something I couldn't hear through the door. "Sir," I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "The shelter is closed. If you need help, come back during business hours." He didn't respond. Instead, he pressed his face to the glass, smearing it with something dark. I thought it was dirt at first, but when I shone my flashlight on him, I realized it was blood. I froze, unsure of what to do. He didn't seem aggressive, just frog. His movements were jerky, like he was being controlled by invisible strings. I decided to call the police. As I backed away to grab my phone, the scratching stopped. I turned back, and he was gone. The parking lot was empty, but the smeared blood on the glass proved I hadn't imagined it. The police arrived quickly and searched the area, but didn't find anyone. They reassured me that it was probably just a disturbed person passing through, but they offered to keep a patrol car nearby for the rest of the night. I thanked them and tried to focus on my work, though my nerves were shot. Around 4 a.m., I heard it again, scratching. This time, it was coming from the kennel area. I rushed back there, and all the animals were on edge. The dogs were growling and barking, and even the cats were hissing menacing and puffed up, but there was no one there, just rows of empty cages and frightened animals. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the cages, which had been locked earlier, was wide open. The dog that had been inside, a sweet, elderly lab named Daisy, was gone. I searched everywhere for her but found no sign of her. When the morning staff arrived, I told them everything. They tried to reassure me, saying Daisy might have escaped during the commotion, but I could see the unease in their faces. A few days later, they found her. Daisy's body was in a wooded area a few miles from the shelter. She was mangled, almost like she'd been attacked by something or someone. After I quit the shelter, I tried to put it all behind me, but the memory of that night clung to me, creeping into my thoughts at the worst times, like when I let my own dog out at night and hear the faint sound of scratching in the wind, or when I passed a wooded area on my way to work. A couple of weeks later, I received a call from Sarah, one of the shelter managers. She apologized for reaching out, knowing I had left, but she sounded rattled. Weird things have been happening, she said hesitantly. You're not the only one who's had incidents. I didn't want to hear more, but my curiosity got the better of me. She explained that since I left, the animals have been behaving strangely, whining, refusing to eat, or clawing at their cages as if trying to escape. Worse, staff members have reported hearing strange noises at night, even on evening shifts when there was still plenty of activity. The other night, I stayed late to check on the animals, Sarah admitted, her voice shaking. I saw something, too. A man, or what I thought was a man. He was standing in the yard behind the kennels. I went out to confront him, but he disappeared. There wasn't even a footprint left in the mud. She paused, and then I found one of the dogs. Her voice broke. It was just like Daisy. I felt sick. Whatever was happening wasn't over, and it sounded like it was escalating. I wanted to tell her to shut the shelter down, to stop exposing herself and the animals to whatever this thing was, but I didn't. She sounded like she was already thinking the same thing. After that, I started noticing odd things around my own house. At first, it was little stuff, my dog barking at the back door in the middle of the night, even though the yard was empty. Once, I found scratches on the inside of my front door. I chalked it up to my dog until I realized the scratches were too high up, like someone had been trying to claw their way in. Then I started hearing the noise. The scratching, always faint, always at night. It wasn't just at my door. Sometimes it seemed to come from the windows or even the walls. I tried telling myself it was just tree branches or a stray animal, but deep down, I knew better. The final straw came 2 nights ago. I woke up to my dog barking furiously at the back door. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. As I approached the door, I froze. There, pressed against the glass, was a handprint smeared in blood. It was fresh, dripping onto the floor. I didn't hesitate. I called the police and barricaded myself in my bedroom with my dog. The officers arrived quickly, but they didn't find anyone. They told me it was probably a prank or someone trying to scare me. They said they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood. But here's the thing, I live in a house with a locked gate. No one should have been able to get into my yard, let alone leave a bloody handprint on my door. I don't know what's happening, but I've started sleeping with all the lights on. My dog won't leave my side, and I'm constantly on edge, jumping at every noise. Last night, something happened that made me question whether I can stay in this house, or anywhere, for that matter. I was lying in bed, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, trying to distract myself from the uneasy silence that seemed to develop the whole house. My dog, Max, lay curled at my feet, but his ears were perked, and his eyes darted toward the door every so often. He was just as on edge as I was. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was coming from the ceiling. I froze, my heart racing. I tried to rationalize it. It had to be something explainable, like a raccoon or a bird that had somehow gotten into the attic. But then I remembered, I don't have an attic. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, moving across the ceiling like it was trying to find a way in. Max began to growl, low and deep in his throat, and his fur stood on end. I didn't dare move, and then it stopped. Just silence. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for the next sound. That's when I heard the faintest whisper. It wasn't coming from the ceiling anymore. It was coming from the vent in the corner of the room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling. It was a low, guttural murmur, like a voice that didn't belong to any human. Max started barking furiously, facing the vent, his teeth bared. I wanted to grab him and run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the vent cover popped off and clattered to the floor. Max lunged forward, barking wildly, but there was nothing there. The whispering had stopped, and the silence felt deafening. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher tried to keep me calm as I locked myself and Max in the bathroom, clutching a heavy flashlight as my only weapon. The police arrived within minutes and searched the house top to bottom. They found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing in the vent. I know what I heard. I know what Max saw. The officers tried to reassure me, but I could tell they thought I was losing it. Before they left, one of them pulled me aside and suggested I might want to consider staying with a friend or family member for a while. I think he could see the fear in my eyes. Today, I started packing. I don't know where I'll go, but I can't stay here. Whatever this thing is, it isn't just following me, it's getting bolder. I'm scared it won't stop until it gets what it wants. I've started doing some research into the shelter's history, hoping to find some kind of explanation. But so far, I've come up empty. I can't shake the feeling that whatever is happening started there, and I can't help but feel responsible for the animals and people who are still there. To the man, or the thing, I don't know what you're or why you've chosen me, but please, for both of our sakes, let's not meet again. This happened about 10 years ago when I was 19. I had just started my first real job, working as a night shift cleaner at a large theme park. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and I loved the idea of wandering around a deserted park after hours. There was something eerie yet peaceful about it. My job was simple: clean the main attractions after the park closed. That night, I was assigned to the old pirate-themed water ride. It was one of the park's oldest attractions, and while it was a favorite for visitors, employees joked about how creepy it got after dark. Stories of odd noises, shadows moving in the water, and the feeling of being watched were common among my coworkers. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, so I brushed it off as workplace gossip. The ride was built like a giant indoor lagoon, with fake shipwrecks, animatronic pirates, and dim lighting meant to replicate moonlight. As I stepped inside, the faint smell of chlorine and mildew hit me. The place was silent, except for the occasional drip of water echoing in the cavernous room. I had a checklist to follow: pick up trash, clean the ride seats, and sweep the walkways. About an hour into my shift, I heard a soft splash. My heart jumped, but I quickly told myself it was probably one of the animatronic figures malfunctioning. That happened all the time, but as I walked toward the sound, I noticed something odd. One of the ride boats, which should have been stationary at the dock, was floating slowly down the water track. I froze, staring at it. It wasn't a current. The water in the ride was still. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing. No answer. I thought maybe another employee was playing a prank, so I walked alongside the track, trying to see if anyone was hiding in the boat. It was empty. Feeling uneasy, I used a long pole to guide the boat back to the dock and secured it with a chain. I tried to shake it off and continued cleaning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. At one point, I heard soft footsteps behind me. When I spun around, there was no one there, just rows of empty seats and plastic pirate mannequins grinning their lifeless smiles. I was almost done when I heard it again, the splash. This time, it was louder. I turned toward the sound and saw that the boat was floating down the track again, but this time, it wasn't empty. There was a figure in the back seat. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see the silhouette of a person sitting perfectly still, their head tilted slightly as if they were watching me. My blood ran cold. "Hey," I shouted, trying to sound brave. "The park's closed. You're not supposed to be here." The figure didn't respond. They didn't move at all. I backed up, reaching for my radio to call security, but before I could, the boat rounded a corner and disappeared into the darkness of the ride's tunnel. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run out of there and never come back, but I couldn't just leave someone in the ride. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and followed the boat. The tunnel was pitch black except for the weak beam of my flashlight. The air was damp and smelled worse than before, like stagnant water. I could hear the faint creak of the boat further ahead but couldn't see it. "Sir, you need to come out now." My voice echoed unnaturally in the narrow space. Still no response. I turned a corner and my flashlight flickered just for a second. That's when I saw it. The boat was stopped in the middle of the track. The figure was gone, but in the water beside it, I saw ripples like someone had just slipped under the surface. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Then I heard the soft, deliberate sound of wet footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just ran. I ran so fast I nearly slipped on the damp floor, my heart pounding like it would burst out of my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside the ride, gasping for air. I radioed security and told them someone was inside the attraction. They searched the entire ride and found nothing. No boats out of place, no signs of anyone being there. When I told them what I saw, they exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say much. I quit a week later. For weeks after I quit, I couldn't get that night out of my head. I kept replaying the events, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a prank, some overzealous thrill seeker who snuck into the park. But every time I tried to rationalize it, I was left with more questions than answers. Why didn't security find anyone? How did the boat unchain itself twice? And most of all, who or what was in that water? I decided decided to do some digging. I reached out to a former coworker who had been at the park for years. We'll call her Maria. She wasn't surprised when I told her why I left, and her reaction made me uneasy. Let me guess, she said, you were on the pirate ride? Yeah, I replied. How did you know? She gave me a nervous laugh. It's always the pirate ride. Everyone who works here long enough has a story about that place. She went on to tell me about the ride's history. Apparently, it had a reputation even before I started working there. Employees reported strange occurrences, tools going missing, lights flickering, and the occasional passenger on the ride after hours. Some of the older staff believed the ride was haunted, but Maria thought it was something darker. Did anyone ever tell you about the accident? She asked. I hadn't heard anything, so she filled me in. Decades ago, during the ride's construction, a worker drowned in the lagoon. He had been repairing one of the underwater mechanisms when something went wrong, and he got tangled in the machinery. The official story was that it was a tragic accident, but rumors swirled that the park cut corners on safety and tried to cover it up. Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. They never recovered his body. That was enough to give me chills, but Maria wasn't finished. Some say he's still down there, stuck in the ride. Other people think it's just something that took his place. Whatever it is, it doesn't like people poking around after dark. I wanted to believe it was just an urban legend, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw that night was connected. I asked Maria if she'd ever experienced anything weird on the ride, and her face turned pale. Once, she admitted, I was locking up after a late shift, and I swear I saw someone standing in the water. Just standing there. When I turned back, they were gone. That was the last time I spoke to Maria. She left the park not long after, and I don't blame her. The park still operates, and as far as I know, the pirate ride is still a main attraction. Sometimes, I'll see ads for it on TV or hear kids talking about their visit, and it sends a shiver down my spine. I'll never go back there. Not for a visit, not for a job, not for anything. After my conversation with Maria, I did my best to move on. I avoided anything that reminded me of the theme park, commercials, photos, even casual mentions from friends. But some things are harder to leave behind than others. I started having vivid nightmares about the ride. In the dreams, I was always back in the dark tunnel, chasing the drifting boat. The water was deeper, though, up to my chest and freezing cold. I could hear something moving in the water, circling me, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. Then, without fail, the dream would end with me turning around and seeing that figure standing in the water. Its face was always obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing and hungry. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The worst part wasn't the dreams, though. It was the sense that whatever had been in that ride hadn't stayed behind. It felt like it had followed me. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone standing there. At night, I'd hear faint splashing sounds outside my bedroom window, even though there was no water anywhere nearby. Once, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor in my apartment. I lived alone. I tried to rationalize it as stress, residual anxiety from the experience. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't in my head. Something was wrong. One night, about 3 months after I quit, I got a call from an unknown number. I wouldn't normally answer, but something compelled me to pick up. A man's voice, calm but cold, spoke on the other end. Stay away from the water, he said. Then the line went dead. I sat there, staring at my phone, my heart racing. Who would say something like that? Was it a prank? Or was it a warning? I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. I'd even asked Maria if she'd ever heard of anything like this happening to former employees. She hadn't, but she seemed genuinely scared for me. Whatever you do, she said, don't go back to the park. Don't even think about it. I wish I could say I took her advice, but the nightmares, the paranoia, it was driving me insane. I needed closure. I needed answers. A few weeks later, I made a terrible decision. I went back. The park was closed for renovations at the time, so I snuck in late one night. I told myself I was just going to take a quick look around the pirate ride, maybe prove to myself that it was all in my head. But the second I stepped inside the building, I knew I'd made a mistake. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the faint smell of mildew hit me like a wall. The ride was eerily silent, even more so than I remembered. The water was still, reflecting the dim emergency lights like a black mirror. I walked along the track, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. Everything looked the same as it had the night I quit, except for one thing, the boat. It was already floating in the water, bobbing gently as if it were waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like I was being pulled forward toward the boat. Before I knew it, I was stepping into it, sitting down in the front seat. The moment I did, the boat started moving. I didn't scream. I didn't call out. I just sat there, frozen, as the boat carried me through the ride. The animatronics were still, their eyes lifeless, their painted smiles mocking me. The air grew colder the deeper we went, and the sound of the water lapping against the boat grew louder, almost deafening. Then we entered the tunnel. It was darker than I remembered, the air damp and suffocating. I could hear something moving in the water, keeping pace with the boat. boat. I gripped the edge of the seat, my knuckles white, and forced myself to look. That's when I saw it. The figure was there, rising slowly from the water, its face shrouded in darkness. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, emerging from the depths, their pale, bloated faces contorted in silent screams. They surrounded the boat, their eyes fixed on me, unblinking and full of malice. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was outside the ride, gasping for air and trembling uncontrollably. My clothes were soaked, and my phone was gone. I ran out of the park and didn't stop until I reached my car. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. The nightmares have stopped, but I still hear the occasional splash or faint footsteps at night. Maybe it's my imagination, or maybe it's something worse. To anyone reading this, if you ever find yourself at a theme park late at night, do yourself a favor, stay far away from the pirate ride, into whatever I saw in that tunnel, to the thing that followed me home. This happened about a year ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I had just moved to a small, quiet town for work. It was one of those places that feels frozen in time. Lots of old shops and abandoned buildings that no one bothers to tear down. One of the more prominent landmarks was an old carnival ground just outside town. The carnival had been shut down for decades, but the locals still talk about it. Some said it closed after a bad accident. Others whispered about darker things, like disappearances. I chalk it up to small town gossip. One evening, I decided to check it out. I'd always been fascinated by abandoned places, and I thought it would make for some cool photos. Armed with my phone and flashlight, I headed out just before sunset. When I got there, the place was eerily quiet. Rusted rides loomed like skeletons in the fading light, and tattered banners flapped weakly in the breeze. The smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. I wandered through the grounds, snappy pictures of the derelict Ferris wheel and the crumbling funhouse. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a mannequin, a leftover prop from one of the attractions. He was sitting in one of the bumper cars, slouched forward like he'd been there forever. His clothes were filthy and tattered, blending into the grime of the car. But then, as I moved closer, he turned his head. It was a slow, deliberate motion, like he was trying to make sure I noticed. "Ted," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This place is off limits, you know." He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head to the side, like a curious dog. Something about the way he moved was too smooth, too deliberate. I backed away, my heart pounding. My flashlight beam wavered as I tried to focus it on him, but it barely seemed to touch him. It was like the shadows around him were alive, swallowing the light. Then he stood up. He was tall, much taller than I'd expected, and his limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally as he unfolded himself from the car. He started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, his footsteps echoing louder than they should have in the empty space. I turned and ran. The carnival felt like a maze in the dark. Rides and stalls loomed out of the shadows, and I kept tripping over debris. I could hear his footsteps behind me, steady and relentless, no matter how fast I ran. Finally, I burst out onto the main road, gasping for air. When I looked back, the entrance to the carnival was dark and empty, no sign of him. I told a coworker about it the next day, and they went pale. "You went there?" they asked, their voice trembling. "Nobody goes to the old carnival. People who do don't always come back." I wish I could say that was the end of it, but it wasn't. A couple of weeks passed, and I did my best to forget about the carnival. I threw myself into work and avoided talking about it. The nightmares were fewer and farther between, and I started convincing myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe it was some drifter who liked squatting there. Maybe the shadows had just played tricks on me. But then, things started happening. It began with the photos I had taken that night. I hadn't dared to look at them until I felt a little braver, but when I finally opened the gallery on my phone, my stomach dropped. Every picture from the carnival was corrupted. At first, I thought it was a glitch, static and streaks of light smearing across the images. But as I flipped through them, I noticed shapes, faces. They weren't clear, but they were there, twisted, grotesque faces staring back at me from the shadows of the rides. I deleted them all. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like distant footsteps. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to listen. The sound grew louder. It wasn't coming from inside the house, but from outside, on the street. I peered through the blinds, my breath caught in my throat. The street was empty, bathed in the pale glow of a flickering street lamp. But then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the light. It was him, the man from the carnival. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his head tilted in that same unnatural way. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. He was watching my house. I don't know how long I stayed there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. The next morning, I told myself it had to be a dream. I wanted to believe it, but as I left for work, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the sidewalk, just outside my house, was a single dusty footprint. I tried to stay calm, to go about my day like nothing was wrong. But that night, he came back. This time, he was closer. I could see him standing on my front out lawn, his head still tilted, his arms hanging limply at his sides. I didn't sleep that night. I started seeing him everywhere, in my rearview mirror while driving, reflected in store windows, always at a distance, always watching. Every time, he was a little closer. Desperate, I went back to my coworker, the one who had warned me about the carnival. I told them everything, hoping they'd have some kind of answer. They listened in silence, their face growing paler with every word. When I finished, they leaned in close and whispered, "You shouldn't have gone there. They don't like to be disturbed." They, I asked, my voice shaking. They repeated, "The ones who never left." I didn't stick around to ask what they meant. That night, I packed a bag and drove as far away from that town as I could. I never told anyone where I was going, and I've been careful not to look back. But sometimes, I still feel like I'm being watched. The other day, I found a dusty footprint outside my new apartment. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. Maybe the footprint was from a passing delivery person or some kid cutting through the complex. But deep down, I knew better. I hadn't seen him since I left that town, but the feeling of being watched had never entirely gone away. The next few weeks were uneventful, or so I thought. I tried to settle into my new life, keeping my head down and avoiding anything that might stir up trouble. But the signs started creeping back in. One night, as I was coming home from work, I found my front door slightly ajar. I froze on the spot, my pulse racing. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. Cautiously, I stepped inside. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but as I moved through the apartment, I noticed a strange smell, like damp earth and old wood. It was faint but unmistakable. Then I saw it. On my kitchen counter, in the middle of the otherwise spotless surface, was a small, rusted token. It looked like one of those old carnival tokens, with faded lettering and an unreadable design stamped into the metal. I didn't touch it. Instead, I packed a bag, left the apartment, and checked into a hotel. I told myself I'd deal with it in the morning, but when I returned the next day, the token was gone. That's when I started hearing the music. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the hum of my apartment. It sounded like an old carnival organ, playing a warped and disjointed melody. It only ever came at night, and it always seemed to be just out of reach, coming from the next room, or the hallway, or even the street outside. I called the building manager, thinking maybe it was a neighbor playing music, but they looked at me like I was crazy. The apartments around mine were vacant. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The music was louder than ever, and it felt like it was coming from inside my bedroom. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam around the room, desperate to find the source. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the corner, half shrouded in shadow. His body seemed taller than before, his limbs impossibly long and thin. His face was obscured, but I could feel his eyes on me. I froze, my hands shaking so badly that the flashlight beam danced erratically across the walls. The music grew louder, a cacophony of distorted notes that made my head throb. Then he moved, not toward me, but closer to the wall. His hand reached out, impossibly long fingers brushing the plaster, and then he disappeared. He didn't walk away or fade into the shadows. He just vanished, as though he'd stepped through the wall itself. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. I was too afraid to close my eyes, too afraid to even turn off the lights. The music didn't come back, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The next day, I decided to leave. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was far from there. But as I packed my things, I found something in my suitcase that made my stomach drop. It was the carnival token, polished and gleaming as though it had just been made. This time, there was no mistaking the inscription. It read, "Admit once." When I was 15, my younger brother, Josh, begged me to take him to the park one evening. It wasn't far from our house, and we'd gone there countless times during the day, but tonight was different. The park was deserted, and the playground, usually bursting with kids, was eerily still. Josh was obsessed with the new jungle gym. It was massive, with tunnels, slides, and rope bridges. He dashed toward it, leaving me to sit on one of the benches. I scrolled through my phone while keeping an eye on him. The faint squeak of the swings and the rustle of the wind were the only sounds. About 10 minutes in, I heard Josh laughing, not his usual laugh, though it sounded off like he was trying too hard. I looked up and saw him perched at the top of the jungle gym, staring down at one of the slides. "Josh, what's so funny?" I called. "There's a man down there," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. I froze. The playground was empty when we arrived. "What do you mean?" "He's funny. He keeps poking his head out and then hiding again," Josh giggled, pointing toward the covered spiral slide. I couldn't see anything from where I was sitting. "Come down here now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady funny, but he's playing hide and seek," Josh protested. I marched toward the jungle gym, my heart pounding. When I got closer, I peered into the slide but saw nothing. "Josh, there's no one here. Come down." Josh hesitated, his smile fading. "He was just here," he whispered. "Now," I said firmly. Reluctantly, he climbed down, and we started walking home. The streetlights cast long shadows on the empty road, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Halfway back, Josh stopped abruptly. "Why is he still following us?" he asked, pointing to the shadows cast by the streetlights. I turned, expecting to see someone. There was nothing. No one. Just the two of us. "Josh, there's no one there," I said, grabbing his hand. "Yes, there is," he insisted, pulling away. "He's walking funny like this." He mimicked a jerky, swaying motion that made my skin crawl. I didn't wait to see what he was talking about. I grabbed his arm and sprinted the rest of the way home. When we got inside, I locked the door and checked all the windows. My parents were out for the evening, so it was just us. Josh seemed fine, even cheerful. He went straight to his room while I stayed in the living room, trying to calm down. A couple of hours later, I heard a knock at the front door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. It was almost midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? I peeked through the peephole, but there was no one there. The porch light flickered, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Then, from Josh's room, I heard him laughing again, the same forced, unnatural laugh from the playground. I rushed to his room and threw the door open. He was sitting on his bed, staring at the corner. "He's back," he said, pointing. The corner was empty, but as I stepped closer, the shadows seemed to shift, like something was hiding just out of sight. I grabbed Josh and bolted out of the house. He waited on the porch until my parents came home, but I didn't tell them what happened. How could I? They'd never believe me. Josh stopped talking about the man after that night, but he refused to go back to the park. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us home. At first, it was subtle, the occasional flicker of a light, the feeling of being watched when no one else was around. But as the days passed, it got worse. One night, about a week after the incident, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, moving back and forth outside my door. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was one of my parents checking on us. But when I glanced at the clock, it was 3:17 a.m., too late for that. "Nope," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. My bedroom door creaked open just an inch, as if someone was testing it. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Then, from Josh's room, I heard that laugh again. It was muffled, like he was trying to keep it quiet, but it was unmistakable. I bolted out of bed and ran to his room. He was sitting up, staring at his open closet. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "He's in there," Josh whispered, pointing at the darkened closet. I flipped on the light, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, but it was empty. Just clothes, shoes, and a couple of old toys. I walked over and pushed the clothes aside, checking every inch of the small space. "Nothing. Josh, there's no one here," I said, trying to sound calm, but my voice wavered. "He's hiding," Josh insisted. "He only shows up when the lights are off." My stomach dropped. I turned to him, trying to think of something reassuring to say, but before I could, the light in the room flickered. Once, twice, then it went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and Josh let out a scream. I grabbed him, pulling him close, as a sound filled the room, a raspy, wheezing noise, like someone struggling to breathe. It was coming from the closet. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. The closet door was swinging slightly, even though there was no draft. The wheezing sound stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. And then, from behind me, I heard a whisper. "Found you." I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction. Nothing, but Josh was shaking, clutching me tightly, tears streaming down his face. "He's here," he sobbed. "He's here." I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, holding Josh, my eyes fixed on the closet. By morning, the room looked normal again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. That day, I told my parents everything. At first, they thought I was imagining things, but when they saw how terrified Josh was, they started to believe something was wrong. My dad called a family friend who was a pastor, and he came over to bless the house. For a while, things seemed to settle down, but every now and then, I still feel it, the cold air, the flickering lights, the sense that someone is watching. Josh won't sleep in his room anymore, and I can't blame him. We never went back to the park, and I avoid driving past it when I can. Life returned to a strange sort of normal after the pastor blessed the house. The heavy feeling that had hung over everything seemed to dissipate, and for a while, I let myself believe it was over. Josh started sleeping in the guest room, and I stopped hearing his unsettling laughter in the middle of the night, but I could tell he still wasn't okay. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and he refused to be alone, even during the day. Every shadow, every creak of the house made him jump. One evening, a few weeks after the blessing, I was cleaning up the living room while my parents were out, and Josh was sitting on the couch, coloring. The TV was on in the background, and everything felt. Until it didn't. It started with a low humming sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the TV, but when I turned it off, the sound persisted. It wasn't coming from any device, it was coming from the hallway, the same hallway where I'd heard the footsteps that night. Josh stopped coloring. He stared at the doorway, his hand frozen mid-stroke. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart racing. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Josh dropped his crayon and clutched my arm. "He's back," he said, his voice trembling. Before I could respond, the lights flickered, not just in the living room, throughout the whole house. The hum returned, now joined by faint whispers, too soft to make out the words. The whispers were coming closer, louder, filling the room. And then the TV turned back on, even though I'd unplugged it. Static filled the screen, and amidst the crackling noise, I saw it, a figure, pale, with long, distorted limbs, crouched in the static like it was trying to push through the screen. Its head jerked unnaturally, tilting back and forth as if it was studying us. Josh screamed, and the figure snapped its head toward him. It raised a hand, long, skeletal fingers pressing against the glass. Then it spoke. "Why did you leave me?" The voice was deep, guttural, and filled with a strange kind of sorrow. The lights flickered violently, and the air grew heavy, oppressive. I grabbed Josh and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pulled. Behind us, the static grew louder. I turned to see the figure now pressing its face against the screen, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, as if it was screaming silently. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and then everything went black. I woke up on the living room floor, with Josh curled up beside me. The house was quiet, and the lights were back to normal. The TV was off, the cord still lying on the ground where I'd unplugged it. For a moment, I thought it had been a dream, until I saw the scratches. 4 long, jagged scratches ran across the living room wall, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Josh wouldn't talk about what happened, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't mean to say anything. I knew he'd said it too. We moved out of that house a month later. My parents thought it was just because we needed a change, that the new house would help Josh and me move past whatever had scared us so badly. But it didn't matter where we went. The thing followed us. This happened a few years ago, and I still can't explain what I experienced. My friends and I were in high school, and one weekend, we decided to explore the old amusement park on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down for decades, ever since a freak accident on one of the rides. Everyone in town said it was cursed, but we just thought it was an exciting, creepy place to explore. We snuck in after dark, armed with flashlights and the confidence only teenagers have. The place was eerie, rusted rides creaked in the wind, faded clown faces leered from peeling murals, and weeds had overtaken what used to be a bustling carnival. At first, it was just harmless fun. We dared each other to climb onto the old Ferris wheel, poked around the decaying ticket booths, and laughed at how spooky the place felt. But then, things started to feel off. It began when we found the carousel. It was in surprisingly good shape compared to the rest of the park. The horses were dusty but intact, their painted eyes glossy and too lifelike. One of my friends, Chris, dared me to sit on one of the horses for a picture. As soon as I climbed on, I swear I heard a faint tune, like a music box, coming from the carousel, but the others swore they didn't hear anything. I laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. We moved on to the funhouse, which had partially collapsed but was still standing enough for us to venture inside. That's when things took a darker turn. As we navigated the maze of warped mirrors, our flashlights began to flicker. We joked that it was just bad batteries, but when all 4 of our lights went out simultaneously, the joking stopped. We stood there in total darkness, the air feeling thick and oppressive. Then, out of nowhere, we heard footsteps. Not ours, and not the soft shuffling of an animal. These were deliberate, heavy steps echoing through the funhouse. We froze, listening as the steps grew louder, closer. Someone whispered, "Run." We bolted, tripping over debris and each other in our rush to escape. But no matter how fast we ran, the footsteps seemed to keep pace with us, always just a few feet behind. When we finally burst out of the funhouse and into the open air, we didn't stop. We ran all the way to the fence we climbed earlier and scrambled over it, panting and terrified. Only once we were safely outside did we look back. That's when we saw it. Standing in the doorway of the funhouse was a figure. It was tall and humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its glowing eyes reflected the moonlight. We never went back to that park, and we don't talk about that night anymore. Sometimes I wonder if it was just our imaginations running wild, but deep down, I know what I saw was real. After that night, we all tried to move on. None of us talked about what had happened at the amusement park. It was like we had some unspoken agreement to bury it and pretend it never happened. happened. But for me, the nightmares started almost immediately. At first, they were vague, just flashes of the figure standing in the doorway of the funhouse, its glowing eyes boring into me. But over time, the dreams became more vivid. I'd find myself back at the park, wandering alone. The rides would be spinning and moving as if the park was alive, even though it was empty. And then I'd hear the footsteps, always behind me, always getting closer. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The worst dream came about a month after our visit. In it, I was standing in front of the carousel. The music was playing again, louder this time, and the horses were moving on their own, bobbing up and down as if invisible children were riding them. I tried to turn and run, but I couldn't move. My feet were stuck to the ground. That's when I saw it. The figure from the funhouse was sitting on one of the horses, its unnaturally long arms draped over the poles. It wasn't looking at me at first, but then its head snapped toward me in one sudden, jerky motion. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I heard it laugh, a deep, guttural sound that echoed in my ears even after I woke up. After that dream, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I called Chris, desperate to know if he'd experienced anything similar. He was reluctant to talk at first, but eventually he admitted that he'd been having nightmares too. So had the others. Chris also told me something I didn't know: the carousel wasn't supposed to be there. According to him, the park never had a carousel when it was opened. He'd asked his dad, who grew up in the area, and he was certain that carousel shouldn't have existed. That's when I decided we needed answers. Against my better judgment, I convinced Chris and one of our other friends, Mia, to go back to the park with me during the day. I told myself it would be less scary in the daylight, that we could investigate without the overwhelming fear we felt that night. When we got there, the park looked just as abandoned as before, but something was different. The carousel, the pristine, creepy carousel, was gone. In its place was an overgrown patch of dirt, like it had never been there at all. Chris looked pale, and Mia kept muttering, "This doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense." We wandered around for a while, but there was no sign of the carousel. It was like it had vanished. But just as we were about to leave, we heard it, the faint sound of a music box, coming from somewhere deeper in the park. My stomach turned to ice, and we all froze. The sound grew louder, and then the footsteps started again. This time, we didn't wait to see anything. We ran faster than we ever run before, and we didn't stop until we were in the car, speeding away from that cursed place. I tried everything to drown out the nightmares and the memories. White noise machines, therapy, even burning sage around my room. Nothing worked. The music box tuned, and the footsteps became part of my life, creeping into the corners of my mind when I least expected it. But it didn't stop with me. About 3 months after our second trip to the park, Mia disappeared. Her mom called me, frantic, asking if I'd seen her or if I knew where she might have gone. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks, but when her mom mentioned that Mia had been acting strange before she vanished, saying things like I need to go back and stop it, I felt the blood drain from my face. I called Chris immediately, and he sounded just as shaken. "You don't think she went back, do you?" he asked. "She wouldn't," I replied, but even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe myself. Chris and I decided to go to her house to look for clues. In her room, everything seemed normal at first glance, but then we found her journal. The last few entries sent chills down my spine. Entry 1, I can hear the music box during the day now. It's not just in my dreams. Am I going crazy? I swear it's getting louder. Entry 2, I saw the figure today. It was standing at the end of my driveway, just watching me. No one else saw it. I think it's calling me back to the park. Final entry, I have to go back. I think it wants me to. Maybe if I go, it'll leave me alone. Maybe it'll leave all of us alone. They called the police and told them everything, but they didn't take us seriously. To them, Mia was just a troubled teenager who probably ran away. But Chris and I knew better. We decided to go back to the park ourselves, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay away. This time, we brought a crowbar and a flashlight each. We weren't planning to fight anything, we just wanted to bring Mia back. The park was even more decrepit than before, but as we stepped inside, the air felt thick and charged, like a thunderstorm was about to hit. They called out for Mia, our voices echoing in the empty space. That's when the music started again. It was louder now, echoing from somewhere deep in the park. We followed the sound, our flashlights trembling in our hands. When we reached the spot where the carousel used to be, we froze. It was back. The carousel stood there, pristine and spinning slowly, even though there was no one on it. The horses bobbed up and down in time with the haunting tune, and there, sitting on one of the horses, was Mia. Her head hung low, and her hands were gripping the pole tightly. "Mia," I shouted, but she didn't respond. Chris and I ran toward her, but as soon as we stepped closer, the air around the carousel seemed to ripple like a heat wave. The figure appeared again, stepping out from behind one of the horses. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs bending and twisting unnaturally, its glowing eyes bored into us, and I swear I heard that same guttural laugh, louder now, vibrating in my chest. Chris froze, but I kept moving, yelling Mia's name. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Her face was blank, her eyes glassy like she wasn't really there. The figure raised one impossibly long arm, pointing at me. The music music grew deafening, and the carousel began spinning faster, the horses blurring into a whirlwind of color. Chris grabbed my arm and yanked me back just as the ground beneath the carousel cracked open. Black smoke poured out, and the figure stepped toward us, its body stretching and distorting as it moved. "We have to go," Chris screamed, dragging me away. I didn't want to leave Mia, but something about the figure, the smoke, the music, it felt like we wouldn't survive if we stayed. We ran. I don't remember how we got out of the park, but when we did, the music stopped abruptly. We turned back, and the park was silent. The carousel, the figure, and Mia, everything was gone. Mia was never found. The police labeled it a runaway case, but Chris and I knew the truth. The park had taken her. Chris moved away a few months later. He said he couldn't stay in a town so close to that place. As for me, I've done my best to move on, but I know the park isn't finished with me. I've been reading this subreddit for a while, but never thought I'd have something to contribute. This happened a few months ago during my graveyard shift at the small regional airport where I work. It still gives me chills every time I think about it. For context, I work security at a mid-sized airport that only runs commercial flights during the day. At night, it's mostly cargo and private flights. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m. by midnight. The terminal is practically deserted, with only a skeleton crew of us patrolling the building. This particular night was no different. Around 2:30 a.m., I was doing my rounds at the terminal. The place was dead silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The lighting was dim, as they turn off most of the overheads after the last commercial flight departs. It was eerie, sure, but I'm used to it. I was walking past gate 7 when I noticed something odd. A woman was sitting in one of the chairs by the window. She was facing away from me, looking out at the dark tarmac. Her hair was long and unkempt, like she hadn't combed it in days, and she was wearing an outdated flight attendant uniform, something I'd only seen in old airline ads from the 70 seconds. I thought it was strange because I hadn't seen her come in, and no private flights were scheduled until morning. I called out. She didn't move. I walked closer, trying to keep my voice calm. "Ma'am, the terminal is closed. Can I help you find your way out?" Still, no response. She didn't even flinch. As I got closer, I started to notice something wasn't right. Her hair looked almost too black, like ink, and her skin was so pale it almost glowed under the dim emergency lights. But what really got me was her reflection in the window. He wasn't there. I stopped dead in my tracks. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the angle, maybe the glass was dirty, but no matter how much I shifted, there was no reflection of her in the window. Just me, standing there like an idiot. I called again, my voice cracking. This time, she turned her head slowly toward me, and my heart nearly stopped. Her eyes, they weren't eyes. They were just black pits, like someone had hollowed them out. Her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide. I don't remember running, but the next thing I knew, I was in the security office, slamming the door shut and locking it. My coworker, Danny, was sitting at the desk eating chips. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. He laughed it off, saying I must have been half asleep. But when I insisted, he humored me and pulled up the security cameras. Here's the thing, the camera for gate 7 showed me standing there, talking to thin air. No shadow, nothing. Danny teased me about it for the rest of the night, but I swear on my life, I saw her. I've been working at the airport for 5 years, and nothing like this has ever happened before or since. After that night, things at the airport started to feel different. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things that were easy to brush off at first. My radio would occasionally pick up static, even when I was standing close to the base station. Lights in the terminal would flicker, but only around gate 7, and sometimes, when I was alone on my rounds, I'd get the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I didn't tell anyone else about it. Danny already thought I was crazy, and I wasn't about to give the rest of the crew any ammunition to joke about. But I started keeping a journal of all the weird things that happened. One night, about 2 weeks after I saw her, I found something in the gate 7 seating area. It was an old flight manual the CAI pilots used before everything went digital. The thing was battered and yellowed, and it had the logo of an airline I'd never heard of, Skylark Aviation. Furious, I looked it up when I got home, but I couldn't find anything. No records of the airline, no old advertisements, nothing. It was like it had never existed. I brought the manual to work the next night to show Danny. "Where'd you find this?" he asked, flipping through it. "Gate 7, I told him." He gave me a weird look. "This thing's ancient. Probably just something a passenger left behind years ago." But that didn't make sense. The terminal gets cleaned top to bottom every night, and this manual looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Still, I didn't argue. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was reading too much into it. That same night, around 3 a.m., the fire alarm went off at the terminal. It wasn't uncommon for the system to glitch, so Danny and I split up to check the building. I headed toward the main concourse course, and Danny went to the cargo area. When I got to gate 7, the alarm was blaring so loudly that it felt like my skull would split. I was about to turn back when I saw her again, the same woman sitting in the exact same spot as before. This time, she was turned toward me, her hollow eyes locked on mine. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her expression was blank, almost sad. "Who are you?" I shouted over the alarm. "What do you want?" She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her arm and pointed toward the window. My heart was pounding as I turned to look, and that's when I saw it, a plane, partially obscured by fog, sitting on the farthest runway. It was old, like something out of a history book, and the Skylark Aviation logo was painted on the tail. The thing that really made my stomach drop was the condition of the plane. It was rusted, corroded, and looked like it had been abandoned for years. The alarm abruptly stopped, plunging the terminal into an eerie silence. When I turned back to the woman, she was gone. I radioed Danny and told him what I'd seen. He thought I was joking, but I convinced him to come out to the tarmac with me. When we got there, the plane was gone. There wasn't even a sign it had been there, no tire marks, no condensation from the fog. Nothing. After that, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I asked one of the older employees, Linda, if she'd ever heard of Skylark Aviation. Her face went pale. "Don't talk about that," she said. "It's bad luck." I pressed her for more information, and after some hesitation, she told me about a crash that happened decades ago. A Skylark Aviation flight had gone down shortly after takeoff, killing everyone on board. The wreckage was never recovered, and for years, there were rumors that the flight was cursed. Since Linda told me about the crash, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I started digging into old records, hoping to find more information about Skylark Aviation and the crash she mentioned. Unfortunately, it wasn't easy. Skylark seemed to be a ghost of an airline. No articles, no official history, nothing. Finally, after weeks of searching, I stumbled upon a thread in an old aviation forum. Someone had posted about ghost flights and mentioned Skylark Aviation Flight 93. According to them, the flight was carrying 74 passengers and 5 crew members when it vanished after departing from the very airport where I work. The official report stated that the wreckage was never recovered and the cause of the crash was labeled as unknown. But what really made my skin crawl were the comments. One user claimed to have worked at the airport years ago and mentioned strange sightings near Gate 7. Another described seeing a phantom plane on the tarmac late at night, just like I had. Someone else mentioned an old legend. The souls of the passengers and crew were still trying to complete their flight, stuck between the living and the dead. I should have stopped there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to do something I regret. The next time I worked the graveyard shift, I brought a small digital recorder with me. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe some static, maybe nothing at all, but I had to try. At around 2:45 a.m., I set up the recorder at Gate 7 and started asking questions. Is anyone here? What happened to Flight 93? Do you need help? I waited in silence, feeling ridiculous, but then I heard it. A faint whisper. It was so quiet I thought I imagined it, but when I played back the recording, it was there, a voice soft and broken, saying, "We're lost." My blood ran cold. I kept listening, and a second voice came through, this one distorted and low. "Help us." I yanked the recorder away like it had burned me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. The air around me felt heavy, oppressive, like I was being watched. That's when I noticed something else. The windows overlooking the tarmac had fogged up, and there were handprints on the glass, handprints from the outside. I bolted. I left the recorder behind and didn't look back until I was safe in the security office. Danny wasn't on shift that night, so I had no one to talk to, no one to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I spent the rest of my shift watching the monitors, and nothing unusual happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The next day, I called in sick. I needed time to process what had happened, but when I finally worked up the courage to check the security logs from that night, the recording was gone. So was the recorder. The airport's been eerily quiet since then. No more flickering lights, no strange smells, no shadows in the corner of my eye. It's almost like they're gone. Like whatever was tied to Gate 7 finally found what they were looking for, or someone. I haven't decided if I'll quit yet, but one thing's for sure, I'll never go near Gate 7 again. And if you ever find yourself at a small regional airport late at night, be careful where you wander. You might find more than you bargained for. For context, I was a college student at the time, traveling back to my hometown for the weekend. My bus was scheduled to leave late at night, around 11:45 p.m., from a rarely used terminal on the outskirts of the city. The terminal was ancient and eerily quiet when I arrived, cracked tiles, flickering fluorescent lights, and an unsettling silence that seemed to amplify every tiny sound. There was no one at the ticket counter, just a sign saying, "Tickets can be purchased on the bus." Weird, but whatever. I figured I'd wait by the boarding area until it was time to leave. About 10 minutes minutes in, a man came out of the shadows from behind the vending machines. I hadn't seen or heard an approach, which was odd considering how quiet the place was. He was dressed in outdated clothing, like something straight out of the 1940s, and he held a newspaper folded neatly under his arm. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes, they didn't seem right. They were too wide, too bright, like they were reflecting light that wasn't there. Waiting for the Midnight Express? He asked, his voice strangely formal. I nodded and mumbled something about the bus running late. He smiled, an unsettling, too wide grin, and sat on the bench across from me. For a while, he didn't say anything, just kept staring at me with those unblinking eyes. I tried to focus on my phone, but the Wi-Fi was spotty, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. Not many people take this route anymore, he said suddenly. It's not safe, you know, things happen on this road. I didn't respond, just shifted uncomfortably in my seat. The terminal was so empty that even the sound of a distant vending machine dropping a soda felt deafening. I was desperate for someone else to show up, anyone, but no one came yet. Then, the man pulled out the newspaper he'd been carrying and unfolded it slowly. It looked ancient, yellow with age. He held it out to me, and I reluctantly took it. The headline said that chilled down my spine, bus crash leaves 18 dead in freak accident. The date on the paper was from decades ago. I looked up to ask him where he'd gotten it, but he was gone. I mean, completely gone. No footsteps, no sound of a door creaking open, just vanished. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe he'd gone to the bathroom or something, but I couldn't shake the unease. At 11:45 on the dot, the bus finally pulled in, and I was the only passenger to board. The driver gave me a strange look as I handed him my money, like he wasn't expecting anyone. The ride was uneventful at first. I kept thinking about that man in the newspaper. When I looked out the window, though, I noticed something strange. The same landmarks kept repeating: an old diner, a rusted out billboard, a lone street lamp flickering in the dark. At first, I thought I was just tired, but after the third time seeing the same diner, I knew something was wrong. I approached the driver and asked him why we weren't making progress. He didn't answer at first, just kept staring straight ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and almost mechanical. This route doesn't go anywhere. I stumbled back to my seat, my heart racing. The landmarks outside the window had stopped repeating. Instead, the road was lined with shadowy figures standing perfectly still, their faces obscure. They all turned to look at the bus as we passed, their heads moving in eerie unison. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually I must have blacked out. When I woke up, I was sitting on a bench outside the terminal, the morning sun shining down on me. The bus was gone, the terminal was locked up, and my luggage was nowhere to be found. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. I tried looking up the accident from the newspaper, but I couldn't find any record of it. Sometimes I wonder if I dreamed the whole thing, until I remember the driver's chilling words: this route doesn't go anywhere. After waking up on the bench, I tried to piece everything together. My phone was still in my pocket, but it was dead, no battery left, though I had charged it fully before heading to the terminal. I glanced around the deserted parking lot, hoping someone would show up, but it was as empty as the night before. Eventually, I decided to walk. The city was only a few miles away, and the sun made everything feel less threatening. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had just dozed off waiting for the bus and dreamed everything else. That seemed plausible enough, even if the dream had been unnervingly vivid. When I got back to campus, my first priority was to charge my phone and figure out what had happened to my belongings. As soon as the phone turned on, it started blowing up with missed calls and texts. The first text I saw froze my blood, from my mom, sent at 2:03 a.m. Are you okay? I just saw something horrible on the news about a bus crash. There were others, from friends and family, asking if I was safe, asking why I wasn't answering, asking why my location had disappeared from our shared tracking app. Confused, I googled bus crash near. The first result made my stomach drop. Fatal bus accident on Old Mill Road, 20 dead, 1 missing. I clicked on the article, scanning it in disbelief. The crash had occurred the same night I was at the terminal, involving the exact route I was supposed to take. The article described how the bus had veered off a cliff on a sharp turn. Most of the passengers and the driver were declared dead at the scene. One body, however, was never recovered. They listed my name as the missing person. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. My heart was pounding, my mouth dry. How could I have been listed as a passenger when I never boarded? Unless I thought back to the man with the newspaper, his pale face, his cryptic warning. Things happen on this road. Had he known what was going to happen? Or had he been something else entirely, something not human? But the worst part wasn't the article, it was the photo included at the bottom. A photo of the crash site, showing the wreckage of the bus in the ravine below. The charred remains of luggage and seats were scattered everywhere, and among them was something that made my blood run cold. It was my backpack, unmistakably mine, sitting among the debris. I didn't tell anyone what had happened that night, not my family, not my friends. I said I missed the bus, lied about leaving my stuff behind at the terminal. I even stopped going home for weekends, opting to stay on campus no matter what. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that man, about his strange smile, his old-fashioned clothes, about how he disappeared without a sound. Weeks turned into months, but I couldn't shake the memory of that night. It felt like a weight I carried everywhere I went. Every time I tried to move on, some small detail would drag me back into the fear. Like the time I walked past a newspaper stand and saw a headline about another accident, eerily similar to mine, or the late night dreams where I was back on the bus, surrounded by shadowy passengers, the driver's voice echoing, "This route doesn't go anywhere." But the strangest part came about 6 months later. I'd started taking evening classes to fill my time and avoid any unnecessary travel. One night, as I was leaving campus, I noticed a bus idling at the curb near the entrance. It was old, not like the modern city buses, but one of those retro models with faded paint and a cracked destination sign. The display simply read, "Final stop." I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a private charter or some vintage collector's project. But as I walked past, the driver leaned out of the window. It was the same man from the terminal. He didn't say anything this time, just gave me that same too-wide grin, his bright eyes locking onto mine. My legs froze, and for a moment, it felt like the world around me had gone silent. No passing cars, no voices, nothing. Then he spoke, his voice clear and cold. "You missed your stop last time. Care to try again?" Panic surged through me, and I bolted in the opposite direction, not stopping until I was safely back in my dorm room. I locked the door, my heart pounding, my chest tight. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. It was a notification from the local transit app, a bus schedule update. The message made my hands shake. New route added, Midnight Express, last stop, Old Mill Road. I deleted the app on the spot. After that, I couldn't sleep properly for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see the man's face or hear the whispery voices of unseen passengers. I became obsessed with figuring out what had happened to me. I pored over every article about the crash, visited forums, even looked into local folklore about the road and the terminal. What I found didn't make me feel any better. Apparently, Old Mill Road had a reputation for being cursed. Over the decades, there had been numerous reports of accidents, strange sightings, and disappearances. One story stuck with me. Back in the 1940s, a bus full of passengers disappeared without a trace on that very route. Witnesses claimed they saw the bus driving into the terminal, but it never came out. Some people believe the passengers were still riding, trapped in some kind of loop, forever reliving their last moments. The description of the missing bus matched the one I'd seen that night outside campus. Now, every time I see a bus, any bus, I feel a chill run down my spine. I've stopped using public transportation altogether, relying on rideshares or walking no matter how inconvenient. It's safer that way, at least that's what I tell myself. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll hear the distant hum of an engine outside my window. I'll peek through the blinds and see a shadowy bus, its headlights glowing faintly in the dark. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to a local theme park that was celebrating its off-season by keeping a few attractions open late. The weather was damp, and a light drizzle had scared off most of the crowd, so the place was eerily empty. It was kind of fun at first, no lines, the sound of distant screams from the coasters echoing into the night. There was one ride I had always loved but rarely got to go on because the lines were so long, the old haunted boat ride. You know the type, dimly lit tunnels, animatronic ghosts, cheesy sound effects. My friends were into it, so I decided to go solo while they hit up the nearby roller coaster. When I got to the ride, there was no one else in line. The ride operator, a tired-looking teenage girl, barely looked up from her phone as she waved me toward a rickety boat. The whole thing was a big rundown, but I shrugged it off. It was all part of the charm, right? The boat drifted into the darkness, and the usual animatronic figures popped up, a skeleton here, a ghoul there. It was cheesy, just like I remembered, but as I got further into the tunnel, the atmosphere shifted, the air felt colder, and the fog machines were so thick I could barely see a foot in front of me. That's when I noticed something strange. The animatronics were moving slower than they should have been, almost jerking unnaturally, like their mechanisms were glitching. One figure, a pirate skeleton, turned its head toward me, and for a split second, I could swear its eyes were plastic. They looked wet, human, and I laughed nervously, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But then I heard it. Footsteps, not the click and whir of the ride's machinery, but soft, wet footsteps, like someone barefoot was walking on the damp floor of the tunnel. They seemed to echo all around me, getting closer closer. I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing there, just the thick fog and the dim glow of flickering lights. The boat suddenly jerked to a stop. Hello, I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The footsteps grew louder, and now I could hear something else, faint whispering. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping, their words indecipherable but urgent. Panic set in as I tried to push the boat forward manually, but it wouldn't budge. The ride had apparently stalled, and I was trapped in the middle of the tunnel. That's when I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, standing perfectly still on the edge of the water. It wasn't an animatronic, I'm sure of it. It was too tall, too real. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out its arms, which were unnaturally long and ended in claw-like fingers. They tilted its head, as if studying me. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they were coming from it. I couldn't understand the words, but they sounded ancient, wrong. I screamed, kicking at the water to try to get the boat to move. Suddenly, the ride jolted back to life, and the boat surged forward. The figure didn't follow, it just stood there, watching me with that unnatural stillness. When I finally emerged into the open air, the ride operator looked up, startled. "Whoa, are you okay?" she asked, clearly confused by my panicked state. I tried to explain what had happened, but she just frowned and shook her head. "No one else is in there. It's been empty all night." After a week of avoiding the topic, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw, or whatever it was, wasn't just a glitchy animatronic or a random hallucination. My dreams were plagued by those whispers, a chorus of unintelligible words that felt closer to a chant. Sometimes, I woke up sweating, convinced I heard faint footsteps in my hallway. Then, about 2 weeks after the theme park trip, I got a message on my phone from an unknown number. The text was simple, "Did you like the ride?" I froze. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe one of my friends was messing with me. I replied with a cautious, "Who is this?" They got no response. After a while, I convinced myself it was just a prank and blocked the number. But things didn't stop there. A few nights later, I was sitting in my living room watching TV when I heard something strange. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the show. But as I turned the volume down, I realized it was unmistakable, those same whispers, low and fragmented, coming from inside my house. I grabbed my phone and stood up, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, near the window. My curtains were drawn, but the sound was clearer now, words I still couldn't understand but that made my skin crawl. I pulled back the curtain, expecting to find a prankster or maybe some kind of malfunctioning speaker, but there was nothing there, just the empty street outside. The whisper stopped. The next morning, I called one of my friends who had been at the theme park with me. I tried to play it off casually, asking if they had noticed anything weird about the place or heard any strange stories. To my surprise, my friend got quiet. "Actually," she said, "I didn't want to freak you out, but when we were leaving, I swear I saw someone standing by the entrance to that ride. Like, a really tall guy. He was just standing there, staring at you as we walked by. I figured it was just some weird employee or something, but now," she trailed off, clearly unsettled. That's when I decided to do some digging. I looked up the history of the theme park, trying to find any stories about accidents, hauntings, anything that might explain what happened. And I found something. Years ago, before the haunted boat ride was installed, that part of the park used to house a different attraction, a wax museum. Apparently, it had been shut down after a tragic incident where one of the workers went missing. According to the articles I found, he was last seen in the tunnels beneath the exhibit, which were repurposed when the boat ride was built. Some people claimed the park covered it up, saying he'd run away, but others believed he died down there. The strangest part, witnesses who worked there at the time claimed they heard whispers and footsteps in the tunnels for weeks after he disappeared. Things only got worse after my research. I started noticing little things around my house that didn't feel right. Objects weren't where I left them. Doors I knew I'd closed would be slightly ajar. At first, I thought I was being paranoid until I started hearing the whispers again. They didn't stay confined to the house. Sometimes, I'd hear them in the grocery store or while walking to my car after work. Always faint, just on the edge of perception, but always the same, those overlapping, incomprehensible voices. No one else seemed to notice. Then one night, I woke up to something that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. It was around 3 a.m. and the room was dead silent. No whispers, no footsteps, nothing. But something felt off. I turned over in bed, half asleep, and froze. My bedroom window, which I always kept locked, was wide open. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around the room. My phone was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, revealing nothing out of place at first. Then I noticed something on the floor by the window. Larger, small, white footprints led from the window to the foot of my bed. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the tracks, trying to convince myself that I was dreaming. But when I reached out and touched the floor, the water was real, cold, soaking into the carpet. I bolted out of bed and turned on every light in the house, checking every room, every closet, every corner. No one was there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I called out of work and decided to visit the theme park again, as much as the thought terrified me. I needed answers, closure, something. When I got there, the place looked as run down as ever. A few rides were operating, but the haunted boat ride was closed. A man in a maintenance uniform was standing near the entrance, and I decided to ask him about it. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound casual. "What happened to the boat ride? Is it under repair?" He looked at me confused. "That ride's been shut down for months," he said. "We had some electrical issues and a small fire last year. Haven't reopened it since." My stomach dropped. "But I went on it 2 weeks ago," I said, my voice shaking. The man's expression darkened. "Impossible," he said. "There's no way anyone could have gone on that ride. It's been sealed off." I stumbled away, my mind racing. If the ride wasn't operational, then what had I been on? That night, the whispers came back, louder than ever. They seemed to surround me, filling every corner of the house. I tried playing music, turning on the TV, anything to drown them out, but nothing worked. And then I saw it, standing in the hallway, just out of the corner of my eye. The figure from the boat ride. Its long arms and shadowy face were unmistakable. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. I grabbed my car keys and ran out of the house, not even bothering to lock the door. I drove to a friend's place and stayed there for the night, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this thing is, it's not tied to the park or the ride. It's tied to me. I live in a small town, and my job requires me to travel to a bigger city every week. It's about a 2-hour train ride each way, and I usually use that time to catch up on podcasts or read. On this particular evening, I had stayed late for a work meeting, so I ended up on the last train home. The train was nearly empty, save for a few other late-night commuters scattered across the cars. I picked a seat by the window in an empty section and settled in with my headphones. About 10 minutes into the ride, I noticed a man sitting a few rows ahead of me, facing the opposite direction. I hadn't seen him bored, and I was sure I'd chosen an empty car. He was wearing an old, tattered coat and a hat pulled low over his face. His clothes looked out of place, like they belonged to someone from another time. I tried to ignore him, chalking it up to my exhaustion, but something about him felt wrong. He wasn't moving, just sitting completely still, like a statue. About halfway through the ride, the train stopped at a station to let a few passengers off. When we started moving again, I glanced back to the man, but he was gone. I thought maybe he had gotten off without me noticing. Relieved, I put my headphones back on and leaned against the window. That's when I felt it, a presence. You know how you just know when someone is staring at you. Slowly, I turned my head, and there he was, sitting in the seat directly across the aisle from me. I froze. He hadn't made a sound, and there was no reason for him to move seats like that. His head was still tilted down, the brim of his hat hiding his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaky. No response. The train rattled on, the sound of the wheels on the tracks unnervingly loud in the silence. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no service, and the conductor wasn't anywhere nearby. I tried to ignore him, telling myself he was just a strange but harmless guy. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him slowly turn his head to face me. I looked directly at him for the first time, and my stomach dropped. His face, it wasn't right. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken and hollow. He looked like a corpse, but his lips twitched into a slight grin when he saw my reaction. I jumped out of my seat and bolted toward the next car. I didn't look back until I reached the door, and when I did, he was standing in the aisle, watching me. Not running, just standing there, smiling. I ran through 2 more cars before I found a group of passengers. Gasping for breath, I told them what had happened. The man offered to go back with me to confront the guy, but when we returned to my car, it was empty. The only thing left behind was a single, worn-out train ticket on my seat. The date on it was from 1946. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the experience. It felt like a stain on my memory, one I couldn't scrub away no matter how hard I tried. I stopped commuting by train altogether, opting to drive instead. It was inconvenient and added time to my day, but the thought of stepping back onto that train sent shivers down my spine. But here's the thing, avoiding the train didn't stop the nightmares. Every night, I dreamed of that man. In my dreams, he was always sitting across from me, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. I could feel his eyes on me, though I never dared to look up. Sometimes, I'd hear his low, raspy breathing. Other times, he'd grin that awful grin, his lips curly like he knew something I didn't. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom freezing cold. It was the middle of summer, but the air was icy enough to make me see my breath. I thought my air conditioning had gone haywire, but when I reached for my phone to check the thermostat, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A worn-out train ticket was lying on my nightstand. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to believe it was real. Instead, I grabbed my keys and bolted out of my apartment, driving to a friend's house in the middle of the night. I stayed there for 2 days, too scared to go home. When I finally mustered the courage to return, the ticket was gone. I convinced myself it had been a nightmare. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, stress piling up and playing tricks on me. But then, the incident started happening again. I'd catch glimpses of him in my peripheral vision, in the reflection of a shop window or a car mirror as I walked through parking lots. Always the same coat, the same hat pulled low. Each time I turned to look, he wasn't there, but the feeling lingered, that awful, gut-wrenching sense of being watched. It got worse when I started hearing him. Late at night, as I tried to sleep, I'd hear the faint sound of train wheels clattering on tracks. At first, it was so quiet I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder as the nights went on. Then came the whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs, like someone sitting at the edge of my bed, muttering under their breath. I could never make out what he was saying, but the tone was cold and mocking, like he was laughing at me. The final straw came last week. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, the faint sound of train wheels echoing in my ears. My room was dark, except for a sliver of moonlight streaming through the window. As I sat up, trying to calm my breathing, I saw him. He was standing in the corner of my bedroom, his silhouette framed by the faint light. The hat, the coat, the faint glit of his teeth as he smiled. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I just sat there, frozen, as he slowly raised one hand and pointed at me. Then, without a sound, he disappeared. I don't know what he wants or why he's haunting me. I've tried looking into the history of the train line, but I haven't found anything that explains who or what he might be. All I know is that I can't escape him. No matter where I go, he follows. I started researching obsessively after that last encounter. If this thing wasn't going to leave me alone, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I scoured forums, old news archives, and anything I could find about the train line, the ticket, and the strange figure I had encountered. Most of it was dead ends, urban legends about haunted stations, rumors about ghostly passengers. None of it felt real, and none of it matched my experience. Until I found the story. It was buried in an obscure blog about urban myths. The post was from 2011, and it described sightings of a shadowy man on the late train. The author claimed he always appeared in the last car, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat, his face obscured. Most accounts ended with the figure vanishing, but one story stood out. A woman claimed the man had followed her off the train and into her home. Days later, she disappeared without a trace. Her apartment had been locked from the inside, and the only thing left behind was a faded train ticket dated decades earlier. My stomach dropped. It sounded too similar to my own experience to dismiss, but the post offered no solutions, no explanation. Just a warning: don't interact with it, don't look at it, don't acknowledge it. I wish I'd read that earlier. The encounters grew more frequent after I read that blog. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt him standing there, watching. The whispers became louder, more distinct, though the words were still incomprehensible. My friends started noticing something was wrong. I was jumpy, pale, barely coherent, but I couldn't tell them. Who would believe me? Then came the night I truly thought it was over. I was driving home late after visiting my parents. The highway was nearly empty, just an endless stretch of dark asphalt lit by my headlights. I had my music on low, trying to keep myself calm, when I saw something ahead. A figure standing on the side of the road. As I approached, my heart sank. It was him. The hat, the coat, the impossible, empty face. He stood perfectly still, but as my car drew closer, he turned his head to look directly at me. I swerved instinctively, nearly losing control of the car. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, he was gone. I was shaky by the time I got home, but I couldn't sit in the driveway. I didn't feel safe anywhere. I locked myself in my house, every door and window bolted, and sat in the living room with every light on. My phone buzzed, and I jumped. It was a text from an unknown number. You can't run forever. I dropped the phone and backed away, heart pounding. Then I heard it, the sound of train wheels on tracks. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was deafening, like a freight train was barreling through my living room. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because I woke up hours later on the floor. The lights were still on, and the house was silent. My phone was lying next to me, its screen cracked, the text thread gone. Since that night, things have been quiet. Too quiet. No whispers, no sightings, no train tickets mysteriously appearing. You think I'd feel relief, but I don't. I feel like it's not over, like he's waiting for something. Waiting for me to let my guard down. To anyone reading this, if you ever see a man on a train and a coat and hat that seem out of place, don't interact with them. Don't look at him, and whatever you do, don't let him follow you. I've never told anyone because it sounds insane, but writing it down here feels like the right thing to do. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, one of those cookie-cutter developments where every street looks the same and every lawn has the same shrubs and mulch. At the center of the neighborhood was a small park with a playground, a few picnic tables, and a rusty metal swing set. It was the kind of place kids played during the day, but no one ever visited after dark. It started one summer evening when I was 16. My parents were out for the night, and my younger sister was at a sleepover. I was supposed to stay stay home and be responsible, but my best friend, Jenna, convinced me to meet her at the park for an hour. She said she had something important to tell me, and I didn't think twice about it. When I got there, Jenna was nowhere in sight. The park was eerily empty. The street lights along the road were on, but the ones near the playground flickered faintly or didn't work at all. I texted her, "Where are you?" No reply. I waited by the picnic tables for a few minutes, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach grew stronger. The air felt heavy. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic creaking. My eyes shifted toward the swing set, and that's when I saw her. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was sitting on one of the swings, gently swaying back and forth. She wore a white dress that seemed too clean, too perfect for the setting. Her head hung low, and her long dark hair covered her face. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound friendly. "Are you okay? Are you here alone?" She didn't answer. The creaking of the swing was the only sound. Something about her felt rugged. She wasn't swinging like a normal kid. It was more like she was being pushed, even though there was no one behind her. I stepped closer. That's when she stopped, dead still. Her head snapped up, and I froze. Her eyes, they were right. They were pitch black. No whites, no irises, just endless darkness. She tilted her head at an unnatural angle and said, in a voice that sounded far too deep for a child, "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. What? The swing creaked again, but this time, she wasn't moving. The sound was coming from somewhere behind me. I whipped around and saw nothing but shadows. When I turned back, the girl was gone. I don't know how I made it home, but I sprinted the whole way, my lungs burning and my skin crawly. When I finally burst through the front door and locked it behind me, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jenna. "Sorry, I can't make it. Felt grounded. Catch up tomorrow." For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision or hear faint whispers when I was alone. At first, I thought it was paranoia, my brain playing tricks on me after the encounter at the park. But then things started happening around the house. It began with small, almost laughable incidents, lights flickering in my room, my alarm clock resetting itself, or the faint sound of creaking, like the swing set, outside my window at night. I told myself it was just faulty wiring or an overactive imagination. That all changed when I found the dirt. One morning, as I got ready for school, I noticed something odd on my bedroom floor. A trail of dirt and small twigs led from my window to my bed. The window was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. My parents thought it was one of the neighborhood cats that had somehow found its way in, though they couldn't explain how it had locked the window behind itself. I tried to convince myself they were right, but deep down, I knew better. The next night, I decided to stay up late and keep watch. I left my bedroom light off and sat in bed, staring at the window. Then night came and went, and nothing happened. I started to feel silly, like I was overreacting. But then, at exactly 3:13 a.m., I heard the faint creak of a swing. It was so quiet at first that I thought it was in my head, but then it grew louder, clearer, as if it were coming closer. My chest tightened. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. She was there, the girl from the park, standing in my backyard, staring up at me. Her black eyes glinted in the faint moonlight, and her head was tilted at that same unnatural angle. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare back as she raised one pale hand and pointed directly at me. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Seconds, minutes, it felt like an eternity. Then she vanished, as if she had never been there at all. But when I finally gathered the courage to check the window the next morning, I found tiny, child-sized footprints in the dirt beneath it. After that night, I begged my parents to move. They thought I was being dramatic, blaming it on teenage angst or an overactive imagination. But I didn't care. I stopped sleeping in my room altogether and started crashing on the couch in the living room. My grades slipped, and I withdrew from friends. Gina tried to talk to me about what was going on, but I couldn't find the words to explain it. How do you tell someone you're being haunted by a little girl who might not even be human? Eventually, my parents caved and decided to sell the house. The night before we moved, I had one last dream, or at least, I think it was a dream. I was back at the park, standing in front of the swing set. The girl was there, sitting on the swing, just like before. This time, she wasn't swaying. She was staring at me. "You can't run," she said, her voice echoing in my head. "I'll find you." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It's been years since that night, and I've moved twice since then, but I still sleep with the curtains drawn and a lamp on. Every now and then, I'll hear about strange things happening in that neighborhood. For a while, life seemed normal again. Moving to a new town gave me the fresh start I desperately needed. I started college, made new friends, and slowly pushed the memories of the girl by the swing set to the back of my mind. But deep down, I'd always felt a lingering sense of unease, like she was still out there, waiting. It wasn't until last year that I realized I hadn't escaped her. I had just moved into a small townhouse with my boyfriend, Nick. It was a cute place in a quiet neighborhood, far from the house I grew up in and even farther from that cursed park. Life was good. We were happy. Then, one evening, Nick came home holding a package. "Hey," he said, setting it on the counter. "This was on the porch for you." I frowned. I hadn't ordered anything. The box was small and unmarked, with no return address. My name was scrawled on the top in shaky, childlike handwriting. My stomach dropped. "What's wrong?" Nick asked, noticing the color drain from my face. "Probably nothing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just some prank." I opened the box, my hands trembling. Inside was a single object, a tiny swing made of twigs and string. It looked exactly like the swing set from the park. Beneath it was a scrap of paper with 4 words scrawled in the same shaky handwriting. "I told you so." I couldn't breathe. My hand shook as I shoved the box away, sending it clattering to the floor. Nick picked it up, looking puzzled. "What is this?" he asked. "Did someone send you a weird craft project?" "I don't know." I lied. "Probably some mistake." But I did know. I knew exactly who it was from. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made my heart race. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move in unnatural ways. At 3:13 a.m., the time I dreaded most, I heard it again. The creak of a swing. It wasn't outside this time. It was in the house. I woke Nick, panicking, but he insisted it was nothing. "It's an old house," he said. "Probably just the floorboard settling." I didn't argue, but I stayed awake, listening. The sound didn't stop until sunrise. Over the next few days, more things started happening. I'd wake up to find dirt on the floor, tiny footprints leading from the front door to our bedroom. Lights flickered constantly, and Nick's usually calm demeanor began to change. He grew irritable, distant, like something was eating away at him. One night, I found him sitting in the living room, staring at the little twig swing. "She's watching us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew. "The girl," he replied, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "She says it's your fault." I grabbed the swing and threw it in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. But even as it burned, I swear I heard her voice, low and guttural, like nails scraping on metal. "You can't escape me." That night, Nick left the house without a word and never came back. His car was found abandoned a few miles away, but there was no sign of him. The police said he probably just needed space, but I knew better. She had taken him. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I haven't stopped moving since. I never stay in one place for too long, and I avoid parks like the plague. But no matter where I go, I can't escape her. Last week, I got another package. Inside was another twig swing, charred at the edges. This time, the note was shorter. "See you soon." I've always loved working at the antique store in my small town. There's something about the stories behind old objects that fascinated me. It's a quiet job, and most of my time is spent cataloging items or helping the occasional customer find the perfect quirky piece for their home. But after what happened last month, I can't step foot in there again. It was a late Friday evening, and I was closing up alone. My boss had left early, trusting me to lock up. The store is quaint, filled to the brim with everything from dusty old books to mismatched china sets and eerie porcelain dolls. As I went through the usual routine, turning off the lights in each section, securing the back door, and double checking the register if something fell off. The store always had a quiet hum from the street lights outside and the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards. That night, it was different. It was too quiet. Even the hum seemed to fade, replaced by a kind of static, like white noise. While locking the display cabinet near the front of the store, I noticed something in the reflection of the glass, a shadow moving near the back. My first instinct was that someone had stayed behind after closing, maybe a customer who didn't realize we were closing up. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. No response. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, walking cautiously toward the back. As I passed rows of antique furniture and shelves of trinkets, the air grew colder. By the time I reached the back corner, I could see my breath in the air. Is someone there? I tried again, louder this time. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping noise, like fingernails on glass. It came from an old grandfather clock we had just received earlier that week. It was a beautiful piece, intricate carvings, and a pendulum that didn't move because it was broken. The tapping continued. My flashlight illuminated the glass face of the clock. I expected to see something harmless, a rat or some loose mechanism causing the sound. But instead, I saw a face. It was pressed against the glass, pale and contorted in a way that didn't seem possible. The eyes were sunken, yet they locked onto mine with a kind of malice I can't describe. The lips twisted into a grin that stretched too far, showing jagged teeth that didn't belong in a human mouth. My body froze. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The face inside the clock tilted slightly, and I swear I saw its lips move. It whispered something, though I couldn't understand the words. Then the tapping stopped, and the pendulum swung. I bolted out of the store, leaving the lights, doors, and everything else. I didn't care. I just ran. The next day, my boss called me, furious that I had it locked up. I didn't tell her what I saw. How could I? I just muttered an apology and quit on the spot. A few days later, I passed by the store. It was closed, with a sign on the door saying, "Under new management." I didn't think much of it until I heard from a coworker that my boss was missing. The police found her car outside the store, but there was no sign of her, just her shoes neatly placed in front of the grandfather clock. A week after quitting, I still couldn't shake the memory of that face in the clock. My nights were restless, filled with dreams where the distorted figure crawled out of the glass, its two long fingers reaching for me. I tried to convince myself it was stress or some bizarre trick of the light, but deep down, I knew what I saw was real. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was something more to that clock. I started researching antique clocks online, hoping to find anything that could explain what I saw. After hours of scrolling through forums and obscure collector websites, I stumbled across an old post on a defunct blog. It was written by someone who claimed to have owned a clock that sounded eerily similar to the one in the store. According to the post, the clock was cursed or haunted, as the writer put it. They mentioned seeing strange faces in the glass, hearing whispers in languages they didn't understand, and experiencing a deep, unshakable dread whenever they were near it. The post ended abruptly, with the writer warning readers to stay away. There were no follow-ups. Against my better judgment, I decided to go back to the store. It had been a week since I left, and I told myself I just needed closure. I wasn't planning on going inside, just driving by to see if the clock was still there. Maybe if I saw it through the window, I could convince myself it was just an ordinary object, and the terror I felt was all in my head. When I pulled up to the store, my stomach dropped. The lights inside were on, but the under new management sign had been replaced with a simple closed notice. I parked across the street, debating whether to go closer when I saw movement inside. A figure was pacing back and forth, their shadow flickering in the light. It was hard to make out who it was, but they seemed agitated, their movements sharp and frantic. I watched as they stopped in front of the grandfather clock, staring at it for what felt like forever. Then they reached out and placed their hand on the glass. I don't know what I expected to happen, but it wasn't this. The person's body jerked violently like they'd been electrocuted. Their head snapped back, and they let out a soundless scream. Before I could react, they collapsed to the floor, and the lights in the store went out. I should have called the police. I should have driven away, but something compelled me to stay. Against every instinct, I crossed the street and peered through the window. The store was pitch dark, but my eyes slowly adjusted. The person was still on the ground, motionless, but the clock was glowing faintly, an unnatural, sickly green light emanating from the glass. And then I saw it. The face. It was clearer than ever, pressed against the glass, grinning at me. Only this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more faces began to emerge, their expressions twisted in agony and rage. The glass rippled like water, and I swear I heard them whispering my name. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and ran to my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For a split second, I saw the face in the backseat, grinning that impossibly wide grin. I've moved to a different town now, far away from that store and that clock. But some nights, I still hear the tapping on my bedroom window, on my bathroom mirror, on the glass of my phone screen. A month passed, and I started to feel like I might be safe. The tapping on glass had become less frequent, and I began to convince myself it was all just in my head. Trauma plays tricks on the mind, right? That's what I told myself. But then, 2 nights ago, something happened that I can't explain away. I was unpacking groceries at my tiny new kitchen. It was late, and the only sounds were the hum of the fridge and the occasional car passing outside. As I reached for a glass from the cabinet, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from an unknown number. "Do you remember me?" My heart sank. It could have been spam, but something about it felt off. Before I could respond or block the number, another message came through, this time with a photo. It was a picture of the grandfather clock. The glass was cracked, and faintly, I could make out the gritty face in the reflection. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. When I picked it up again, the message thread was gone. No trace of the number, no photo, nothing. I didn't sleep at night. I kept all the lights on and sat in the middle of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, as if that could protect me from whatever was happening. But nothing came, no tapping, no whispers, no strange faces. By the next morning, I was exhausted but determined. I decided to find out where the clock was now. I had to know if someone else had taken it, if someone else was experiencing what I did. Maybe I wasn't the only one. I drove to the antique store, but when I arrived, it was boarded up. A for lease sign hung crookedly on the door. The windows were covered, but through a small gap, I could see that the place had been gutted. All the antiques were gone, and the store was empty, except for the clock. It stood in the middle of the barren room, like it had always been there. there. The glass was cracked just like in the photo, but the face was gone. As I stared at it, I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The air around me grew heavier, almost suffocating. Then I felt it. A tap, not on the glass this time, but on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The street was empty. When I turned back to the window, the clock was gone. I ran to my car and drove straight home, my mind racing. I thought I was losing it, maybe I already had. But when I got home, something was waiting for me. The clock, it was standing in my living room, right in the middle of the rug. I don't know how it got there. The front door was locked, the windows were shut, and I lived alone. But there it was, as real as the air I was struggling to breathe. The face was back, but it was different this time. It wasn't grinning, it was staring at me with empty, hollow eyes, and its lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "It's your turn." The clock began to tick. The pendulum swung faster and faster as the face pressed harder against the glass. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whisper started again, louder now, filling my ears with a language that made my head ache. I don't remember much after that. I woke up hours later on the floor. The clock was gone, but my apartment felt rug. The mirrors seemed to ripple when I walked past them, and the glass in my windows felt warm to the touch. Now, every night, I hear the ticking. It's faint, but it's there, like a heartbeat in the walls. I know it's not over. The clock is waiting, watching, somewhere just out of sight. If you ever come across an antique grandfather clock with a cracked face and a broken pendulum, don't touch it. Don't even look at it. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.